Richard gets kudos for putting together this presentation, as well as our 8 prior webinars such as this. We've been doing these since 2012. And he's a former cooperative extension forestry advisor and a forestry specialist for over 20 years with the University of California. And now he's a private consultant, such as the work he's doing for NorCal SAF, as well as the California Department of Forestry Fire and Resource Assessment Program, and a host of other clients. So Richard is going to share with us the work that he has been doing with the current assessment. So I'll turn it over to Richard. You're on.
All right, here I am. And I have to say at the outset that keep your eyes open for what used to be the 2015 FRAP assessment. It's now 2016. Unfortunately for the FRAP staff, some other priorities have come down the pike that have sort of delayed the publication of the FRAP assessment. But I do want to say that the maps, for example, that I'm going to be displaying in this presentation, they have been more or less finalized, and they will be available on the FRAP website. So even though they're not going to be very readable in this presentation, you will be able to interact with those maps on the FRAP website, hopefully in the near future. That will include the maps of the biomass and the forest products facilities in California, but lots of other information. As always, the FRAP assessment is always going to include a lot of graphics. So my outline here, I'm going to talk about what we'll call commercial forest resources, forest ownership versus growth, timber harvest trends, what we're referring to as the management landscape, third-party certification of forest management, and then the landowner assistance programs. This is essentially my entire FRAP chapter, and bear with me, but you're going to get a preview of what will eventually be published. The data sources for this information that I'm going to present are, first off, the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, otherwise fondly known as FIA. The results I'll be talking about are obtained from sampling between 2001 and 2010 that we updated up to 2013. And I'll explain a little bit more how that works in a minute. The CAL FIRE Forest Practices Database, which is an incredible warehouse of information on timber harvesting. And this has all the data compiled between 1997 and 2014, and also data on regulatory initiatives. And I want to express my appreciation right now to Francesca Rohr from CAL FIRE, who very patiently walked me through all that data. I looked at the websites of third-party certification organizations, but then I also conducted inventories with all of the parties who are certified in California, as well as other parties who are involved with regulatory, either voluntary or, shall we say, involuntary regulatory initiatives. So FIA is the Comprehensive Forest Inventory for the U.S. All of the forest data for the U.S. is collected by the Forest Service on a continuing basis in a series of permanent plots. And in California, I forget how many there are, but you can see the distribution of them in the graphic on the right. The FIA data are considered to be, you know, the sort of Cadillac of inventory data for forest resources in California. They are the data that ARB uses to estimate current forest and carbon stocks. A report will be forthcoming. It's still in press, if you can believe that. California's forest resources for data analysis between 2001 and 2010, and what that represents is a complete sampling cycle where all of the plots have been sampled and are included. So it takes them 10 years to visit all of the plots. And so now they're engaged in the next cycle, 2014, they're 40% through. And there'll be another forest inventory analysis that will be conducted 2020, which should be somewhat interesting when you compare it to today's results. So first thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the difference between forest land versus timberland. When we think about timberland, what we're talking about really is land that has the potential to produce commercial timber products. And it's defined by FIA as land capable of producing 20 cubic feet per acre per year of fiber. Now that might sound awfully, I don't know, I guess, what does that mean? But that really means that you can potentially make a living growing timber on that land. The state defines it somewhat differently at 15 cubic feet per acre per year. Most of you probably are familiar with the concept of site class. Site 1, Site 2, Site 3 timberland. FIA has its own definitions for site class. Suffice it to say that in the state system, sites that are site class 1, 2, 3, or 4 are considered to be potentially commercial timberland, and that correlates well with some of the FIA distinctions or breaks. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Forest land is just land with trees on it where there's more than 10% canopy cover. It's not necessarily considered to be productive timberland. It's not considered necessarily to be even commercial timber species. Now, timberland can include commercial and non-commercial tree species, and there's a lot of timberland out there that's dominated by hardwoods, which are not considered commercial species in California. So the majority of the most productive private timberland is, and I'm just talking about private land now, is located in the Redwood region and is in industrial ownership. Again, all the maps that I'm showing here, even though you have to squint to see something, they will be available on the FRAP website after publication of the assessment, and you'll be able to interact on these, zoom in. But you should be able to see that the dark green, which is the most productive timberland, class 1 under the state, and 225, I won't even explain what that is, but FIA site class 225 cubic feet per acre per year. That dark green, you can see it's pretty much concentrated on the North Coast on the private lands. This does not include the public lands, the Forest Service lands, and most of you that are familiar with the Central Sierra know that there's a chunk of Site 1 timberland located in the Central Sierra too, but this is just the private land. So some general statistics, forest and timberland by ownership, and again, this is based on the FIA. So there's 32 million acres of forest land in California. About 16.8 million acres of that is timberland, and the rest of it is, either forest or in reserves. So this breaks it down between reserved and unreserved. Reserves meaning it's not available for timber harvesting. So about there's 17 million acres of timberland, publicly owned, and private owners own about 3.9 million acres, at the ones that are primarily engaged in timber production. Over 30% of public timberland, that is land that is capable of producing commercial timber crops, not available for timber harvest. It's in reserves. Non-industrial owners own about 3.5 million acres of timberland. They also own about 5 million acres of forest land that is not considered commercially productive. So the area of working forest, and that means forest that is actively managed for some degree of timber production. the area of working forest owned and managed by conservation organizations and land trusts is increasing in the state. So you can kind of figure that the primary owners are obviously the Forest Service, the industrial timber companies, and then there's a ton of non-industrial land, but only a small percentage of that is actually actively managed for timber. Some details: commercial conifer forests constitute about 12 million acres of timberland out of the 32 million total acres of forest. Hardwood forest types cover about 13 million acres. That includes like the oak woodlands, for example. And so 4.7 million acres of that is classed as timberland. Now that may be oak woodland, for example, or tan oak woodlands that would support commercial conifer species, but are not currently occupied by conifer species. So the net tree volume in the state exceeds 100 billion board feet. That's a pretty abstract notion, but 2/3 of that is on public land. And if you look at the distribution of the resource on public versus private land, public land has greater percentages of volume in larger diameter classes than private land. So there's more big trees on public land. So again, these are FRAP maps, and you'll be able to review these at your leisure when they're finally published. What this does is it's on the left, the conifer forest. It makes a distinction between forest, as I just talked about it, conifer timberland, and conifer woodland. And conifer woodland really means non-commercial conifers like juniper. Conifer forest is less than 20 cubic feet per acre per year. So you can see that the conifer timberland, again, it's hard to really see much here, but there's a fairly large percentage of the conifer timberland of the total forest is actually on the north coast and in the central Sierra. Hardwood forests on the right, there's a distinction between hardwood forest and hardwood woodland. Hardwood timberland is you can see it's relatively limited. So these maps, again, will be available. The quantities of how much is in each of these types will be in the forest chapter for those of you that like numbers like that. Now, one of the things that we found somewhat difficult to do, but nevertheless very useful to do, was to look at what we call the timber asset. And so how much timber volume is there out there on the landscape at the current time? And so we kind of went back and forth on this, and we consulted with people who work in the forest industry and other foresters, and we kind of made a break even here, a break point in terms of conifer volume, 1,000 board feet per acre. The most productive, or the most fully stocked, highest volume was considered to be 50,000 board feet per acre, and the least was 0.4. That's really essentially not stocked. Okay, that doesn't really have any merchantable volume on it. So if you think about it, the medium and the high classes here, the green and the dark green, that's where the volume is. Now, site productivity, if you look at site productivity and you say, well, where are the most productive sites? It's not always correlated with where the timber inventory is. In other words, there's some productive sites out there that aren't stocked to their potential. And so that's actually a management opportunity. And when we look at opportunities to enhance the forest resource in California, one of the ways to enhance it is to increase the stocking on lands that are understocked. And as I'll talk about later, there's a kind of a converse to that as well. So let's look at harvest, mortality, and growth. And if you recall one of Keith's slides, which showed the sort of net volume, how much mortality, how much volume, how much growth, what was the net. One of the things you would have noticed was that national forest wilderness areas actually are in deficit in terms of mortality, harvest, and growth. No harvest is going on there, but there's a heck of a lot of mortality. So the amount of mortality that's happening in national forest wilderness areas is offsetting the growth. So there's a deficit. If you look at national forest timberland, the first chart here is on national forests, okay? And removals mean harvest. There's really been almost zero harvest on national forest timberland for the period of record that we're talking about here, 2001 to 2006, 2006 to 2010. So the growth is well in excess of mortality and removals. And so the net change is positive. Okay? So that's the national forest picture. All forest land is positive. Timberland is positive to a greater extent than all forest land. Wilderness is negative, and other forests, which would mean not timberland, okay, is still slightly positive. Now let's look at the private lands and other public. If you take other federal lands, and what we're talking about there is national parks, the growth versus removals, limited versus mortality, gives you quite a pulse of net positive impact in terms of accrual of volume, and really accrual of carbon. If you look at state and local, there's almost no removal and almost no mortality. And so the growth is almost equal to the net positive impact. Look at corporate timberland. These are your forest industry folks. Removal, that's where the timber harvest is occurring, right? But it's still not sufficient to offset all of the growth, so there's still a positive impact in terms of accrual of volume and accrual of carbon. Non-corporate, that's your sentient beings that own 8.5 million acres of California forest and timberland. They are removals, so there's some going on. There's some people that are actually harvesting timber and making a living at it, and then there's some mortality going on, but still there's a positive accrual of volume and carbon. Now, look at these dates, okay? So the previous one, the data analysis was 2001 to 2006 and 2006 to 2010. The second one was 1991 to 1994 and 2007 to 2010. Has anything changed since 2010? So let's talk about forest land in need of restoration. Now, the way we defined the need for restoration was if the land was either understocked relative to site potential, that is, it wasn't supporting as much volume or trees as it could. And stocking is usually thought about in terms of something I'm not going to try to explain, which is called stand density index. There's sort of an optimum stocking for site productivity, which is going to be reflected in the number of trees per acre and size. And so understocked stands could be enhanced by increasing the stocking. And as of 2013, there were over 2 million acres of commercial timberland that were either non-stocked or poorly stocked. On the right, you see a little picture from the King Fire, and there's the legacy of non-stocked. There's areas that burned and were never restocked, and there's a ton of acres out there like that. At least another 1 million acres of forest land, not just timberland, were excessively stocked. That meant they had more trees than they should, and they're at risk of disease, insect attack, or wildfire. So in total, we have over 2.5 million acres of timberland in need of restoration. And those are sites that would naturally support commercial conifer species. Now again, all of this was based on data collected as much as 15 years ago. And as Keith was pointing out, mortality. The last estimate I saw was passing around kind of after a meeting addressing national forests. And it was estimated that there were 5 billion board feet of dead trees on national forests at the current time. Now that's not reflected in the data that I'm presenting here. And it's a serious issue that kind of really throws, I would say, kind of the credibility of the FIA data. Makes it kind of suspect, and you have to take it all kind of with a grain of salt. So summary, the amount of forest land hasn't changed over the last decade or more. Land conversion, unlike other parts of the country, land conversion is not really a major problem here in terms of timberland and forest land. Ownership patterns have shifted, and the amount of land in reserve status has increased. The FIA data indicates that potential site productivity is not being realized on a lot of land. And there's a lot of land that's susceptible to wildfire, insects, and disease. The long-term drought effects are not reflected in the FIA data. That's why we're holding this webinar series, is to bring you up to date on that. The data indicates that harvest and mortality do not exceed growth on any land type except national forest wilderness. Again, the effects of the extensive mortality in recent wildfires are not reflected in these data. And really, the bottom line is the amount of forest and timberland in need of restoration continues to grow at a rate that we don't really even appreciate. So let's talk about timber harvesting. So timber production in the state has declined substantially since the 80s and early 90s. Between 1990 and 2013, the volume of timber harvesting declined from 4 billion board feet per year to 1.6 billion board feet, and virtually all of that's now coming off private lands. The fluctuations in timber values and increasing harvesting costs have also had an impact on production in terms of how much timber is harvested every year. So let's look at, these are trends, total timber harvest plans between 1997 and 2014 was over 9,000. NTMPs, those are non-industrial timber management plans. Keith alluded to the Working Forest Management Plan being based on NTMPs, and that would extend that potential regulatory relief really to lands that are 15,000 acres or more. There were 2,100 notices of harvest on NTMP lands. Look at the number of TMPs over time. From really 1,000, let's just call it 1,000 in the late 90s, down to around 200 in 2009, which incidentally was the low point in stumpage values. So, the number of THPs is definitely, it's positively correlated with timber prices, unless you're on some lands where potentially they have to harvest at a at a rate to support a maybe a mill or something, and maybe they have to harvest even when the timber prices are low. When I worked at the Hooper Reservation, I found that the Bureau of Indian Affairs managed to always accelerate harvest when stumpage values of Douglas fir were at their least, because they wanted to maintain a particular level of volume. That is not a very good policy if you're trying to make money. Timber harvest trends in terms of acres harvested between that same time period, 2.9 million acres. In 1997, there were 238,000 acres harvested. In 2014, it was 135,000 acres. What's changed is that the average size of timber harvest land has increased. And there's, reasons for that, but probably the most credible reason is increased regulatory costs. Timber harvest trends in terms of silviculture. In 1997, 42% of the timber harvesting was done with even-age methods. That means clear cutting, shelter wood, seed tree removal, 33% selection. That's changed. In 2014, it's down to 35% even-age, 53% selection. So we have a shift from even-age management to uneven-age management. And there's reasons for that that I'll go into in a few minutes. Well, obviously, clear cutting is still controversial. I would say that we've got this kind of image firmly ensconced in our heads as to what clear cutting looks like, but that's not what it looks like today. So here's some clear cutting pictures, courtesy of Gary Rynerson from Green Diamond, showing that clear cutting looks a little bit different today. And if you look at it at a landscape scale, in the Central Sierra, this is the distribution of clear cuts on some industrial timberland. You see that there is retention of structure inside of clear cuts. You can see these patches where structure is being retained. You can see the streamside protection zones, adjacency constraints. You can't have clear cuts right next to each other until the clear cuts are fully stocked, and you have size limits. So that's kind of interesting in terms, especially size limits, I think have really radically changed over the last decade or so. Now let's look at the coast, and this picture just really blew me away when I saw it. Look at the extensive numbers of riparian buffers in this landscape and the habitat reserves that are set aside to protect endangered species, the size limits on clear cuts. This landscape is, incredible in terms of the intensity of management, and the resource protection that's going on, as I'll explain in a minute, is largely due to changes in rules. So you have increased regulatory requirements to protect wildlife, fisheries, and water quality, particularly on the coast. And, Keith didn't go into this, but you have special rules that apply to timber harvesting in anadromous fish watersheds. And those have radically changed both the intensity of harvesting as well as the type of harvesting that goes on. You have changes in the management regimes of some companies. So they've shifted, just take, why don't we just pause for a minute and think back on Pacific Lumber Company. When they started clear cutting, in the late 80s after the Hurwitz acquisition, and everybody, sort of protested that change in philosophy because before then, Pacific Lumber Company had practiced uneven age management. Well, if you look at Humboldt Redwoods now, they've shifted largely back to uneven age management. And then you have the voluntary participation by companies, industrial timber companies, in regulatory initiatives and certification programs. and I'll talk about that in a minute. So summary on terms of timber harvesting. Numbers of THPs filed and total areas have declined over the last 17 years, and that's consistent with a decline in timber production. Size of the THPs have increased. Harvesting with uneven age methods has increased, and even age harvesting results have changed. So when we started to think about, how does this all fit together out there in the woods, we started to ponder, well, can we define land ownership based on its emphasis on commodities? And so we looked at 4 different classes of commodity emphasis. High, which would be the forest industry. They're in the business of producing timber and making money at it. Medium, where timber production is one of multiple objectives. Low, where there's limited evidence of timber production emphasis, but there's maybe something going on. But then there's non-commodity, and those are reserves and non-commercial forest types. Now again, these maps will be available on the FRAP website. There's what it looks like on a statewide basis, but when you disaggregate down to the county level, then you start to look at some of the finer points. Okay, so if you have a high commodity emphasis, you're a timber industry company, you can be certified or uncertified, and I'll be talking about certification in a minute, but that makes a difference in how you operate. If you're a medium commodity emphasis, it means you have timber production as one of your goals. You could be a forest industry operating under special rules. You could be a non-industrial with a NTMP. You could be a carbon offset project, certified by ARB. You could be a conservation organization that's producing some timber on your lands, like Conservation Fund. You could be a tribal project. Low commercial emphasis, low commodity emphasis, non-industrial with no NTMP, non-commodity emphasis would be reserves, primarily. But just look at that, that mosaic. And one of the things it suggests to me is when you talk about collaborative planning among landowners, it gets kind of difficult if your neighbors have different objectives than you. Excuse me. So talking about these mandatory and voluntary regulatory initiatives, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but the state forest practice rules require sustained yield management for properties that are 50,000 acres or more. And they require either the preparation of a sustained yield plan that demonstrates that you're not cutting more than you're growing. And that, in the state, that applies to 350,000 acres. And then there's another thing called an Option A, which applies to 3.9 million acres. And that is an option that's less than a sustained yield plan, but you still have to demonstrate that you're harvesting less than growth. And when you file your Option A, your subsequent timber harvest plans are reviewed in light of those targets. And you're not allowed to violate your Option A agreement. So then you also have non-industrial timber management plans, which by definition are supposed to manage on a sustained yield, uneven age basis. Those cover 319,000 acres. You have PTEIRs. Now what those are, and Keith talked about the PTEIR for the veg management program, these permit a sort of programmatic approvals for timber harvesting where you just have to, again, issue a notice. There's 4 of those. One of those applies to industrial property. There's another one in process for an industrial property that would double the amount of land under a PTEIR. The other 2 apply to lands which are primarily being managed for fuels treatments and fire hazard reduction. You have habitat conservation plan, natural community conservation plans, ACPs being federal, subject to the ESA, NCCPs being subject to the state's natural communities conservation plan regulations. There's 6 of those, and they cover 748,000 acres. Those are primarily aimed at the protection of threatened and endangered species. Now, there's some properties have more than one of these initiatives in place. Now, these are NCCPs, HCPs are voluntary. You don't have to do them. PTEIRs are also voluntary. You don't have to do them. NTMPs are also voluntary. You don't have to do them. You have to comply with sustained yield, so that applies to most of the industrial timberland. But the other ones are voluntary, which means that people are engaging in these because they either want to reduce regulatory burdens or even demonstrate that they are managing on a more ecological basis. So what about third-party certification? Well, there's 3 certification programs out there. There's the Forest Stewardship Council, there's the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and there's the American Tree Farm System. Plus, we have the Air Resources Board Carbon Offset Program. I was frankly amazed to find that of the industrial timberland out there, 1.5 million acres of, well, not just the industrial timberland, also the medium commodity lands, 1.5 million acres is been certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. 2 million acres have been certified by the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, primarily one company, actually. And then the Tree Farm System has certified 455,000 acres. All of these are third-party certified, which means somebody comes in and looks at what you're doing and says, what you're doing is practicing sustainable forestry. I was amazed when I saw this. The ARB projects, there's a bunch of them outside of the state in places like Michigan, and I can't remember where they all are. But there's 6 compliance projects covering almost 50,000 acres in California, and 5 what are called early action projects covering another 59,000 acres. So, you know, we've got some activity. There's a bunch more in the pipeline. ARB projects who do permit working forests. They're not meant to just be set-asides of timberland. You can demonstrate improved forest management. And in doing that, you can get carbon credits and sell them. So virtually all the lands with high and moderate commodity inputs are certified by third parties for sustainable management. So the certification standards vary, of course. You know, this one on the left was done to try and compare the different certification standards in terms of their economic impacts on practitioners. The one on the right really compared forest certification systems, SFI and FSC, with what you have to do under the forest practice rules. And what I found in my survey of practitioners was that the forest practice rules in California go a long way towards achieving the requirements of the certification of the certifiers, if you will. And then if you fold in the option A and sustained yield plan, they also go a long way towards meeting the requirements for planning under those 2 systems. So of the 12.6 million acres of private forest land, over a third has demonstrable regulatory evidence of sustainable management. We have a complex management landscape out there that potentially creates obstacles to coordinated resource management. Over 4 million acres is certified by third parties, and there's some controversy over the comparative rigor. I mean, there are people that say, you know, well, SFI, that's just an industry ploy. Well, FSC, you know, they've been caved in. Now that they're certifying even age management, they've, you know, caved in. But, you know, I guess everybody has their views. I would just tend to back off and say, look at the facts, see what is done in terms of what thresholds people have to meet. Look at the product on the ground and make your own decision. So over 8 million acres of forest land is owned by entities like you and me that show limited evidence of active management. They essentially seem to be doing almost nothing. Now, my last topic I'm going to talk about is landowner assistance. And we have several providers in California. Cooperative Extension provides technical assistance. The NRCS provides technical assistance as well as funding. CAL FIRE provides both. We have resource conservation districts, which can be pipelines for funding or helping people find funding and also provide technical assistance. This document on the right, the California Cooperative Forest Management Plan, was developed by CAL FIRE and NRCS and the Forest Service to try to qualify people for cost share programs through one comprehensive plan. And some years back, we did some workshops on these, and I think Stu, I heard on a conference call this morning that Stu McMorrow, who is now in head of the CFIP program, many of the CFIP projects that are being funded are for these plans. And some years back, almost all of the funding went for these plans. So once you have one of these plans, you qualify for other programs. So let's look at CFIP first. Historically, it provided funding to do forest management to increase or enhance productivity. Emphasis has shifted to fuel reduction and management plans. So between 2008 and 2014, there were 147 projects that were funded covering nearly 9,000 acres. Well, you say, well, that's great. But, wow, the funding for 2016 is over $3 million, which is, an incredible increase in the amount of money available for this program. And I think Stu this morning said there were currently 23 projects in the pipeline for this year for $400,000. There's still $3 million out there, so get your pens ready and write your CFIP applications right away. The California Forest Legacy Program is another state program, but it's really based on a national federal program administered through Congress. It provides funding to acquire working forest and conservation easements. California competes annually for congressionally appropriated funds. To date, there are 22 projects on nearly 96,000 acres, and they've utilized over $15 million in federal funds. This morning, Jeff Galbert was saying that they're about to hit their 100,000 acre threshold, and there's several projects that are in the pipeline that look very promising. And so this year they probably will be celebrating 100,000 acres of acquisition. Now, these are not all fee acquisitions. These also involve conservation easements. These are not strictly reserves. These are maybe working forests, which means they have some commodity emphasis. So, that's the Forest Legacy Program. And there's lots of surprises came from doing this work over the last year and a half. And one of the biggest surprises I had was the NRCS has just gone out of their way over the last several years to provide funding to forest projects. So it provides, under the EQIP program, it provides funding for forest treatment and, again, thinning to reduce fuel loads, maybe post-fire response, reforestation. Just between 2010 and 2014, they funded 624 projects affecting 2.3 million acres at a cost of $13.6 million. Now, is it the turtle in the hare here? I mean, in terms of CFIP and CAL FIRE being sort of the turtle and NRCS kind of leading the charge. Between 2013 and 2014, they had 28 projects on 26,000 acres to address post-wildfire erosion control and recovery. Now, hopefully, when you look at this, you kind of say, well, the increased funding for CTIP is going to bring CAL FIRE in sort of closer to where the NRCS has been funding projects over the past several years, and that's a good thing, really good thing. NRCS also has the Healthy Forest Reserve program, and in most states that's used for conservation easements, kind of like Forest Legacy, right? But in California, they've used the funding to do projects on Forest Legacy parcels to benefit indigenous fish recovery. So between 2010 and 2013, they funded 11 projects affecting 23,000 acres. And again, these were to improve fisheries habitat. Future funding for the program is uncertain, but there's a new program out there, Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So keep your eyes open for something coming down the pike on that over the next year or so. Other programs, there's other state and federal programs. They're not usually accessible to private landowners. I mean, they may be accessible to resource conservation districts or NGOs, but not to individuals. The Sierra Nevada Conservancy is an example. Under Prop 84, it distributed over $50 million to more than 300 projects sponsored by public agencies and nonprofit groups. Under Prop 1, it's hoped that they're going to re-energize their funding to the Sierra Nevada landowners, or shall we say consortiums of landowners. I haven't really followed what's been happening with Prop 1, and I don't see anybody on, I don't see Nick Ensis on our call today. But in any event, keep your eyes open for Sierra Nevada Conservancy. I think their grant program is up and running under Prop 1. Some other programs, there's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Grants were awarded for 2014-2015. This is AB 32 money. So Margie says that information about the Prop 1 funding programs on their website. So check out the Sierra Nevada Conservancy website. Oh, Margie works for Essence. I shouldn't read that. Actually, I'm not supposed to read the chat box. Anyway, I was saying, so under the GGRF, grants were awarded for 2014. No funding has been allocated for 2016. Mainly the projects funded were reforestation projects. There were a couple of pest control projects that were funded, but the majority were reforestation projects. You have what's called the SRA grant, and these are, Keith alluded to the fact that people who live in the state responsibility area now have to pay a fee for fire protection. Well, that money has been used to roll into a grant program, and in 2015-16, there's $5 million available to public agencies and nonprofit groups to do project aimed at fire hazard reduction. And I'm currently working on one of these projects, which is a community wildfire protection plan for El Dorado County. So there's other money that's been allocated to specific on-the-ground treatment, but I know of at least 2 community wildfire protection plans that have been funded by SRA grants. There's also AB 1492, the Timber Regulation Forest Restoration Fund, and Russ Henley is really leading the charge on this at the Resources Agency. The proceeds are used to improve timber harvest plan review and for forest and watershed restoration projects. Currently, the money has been allocated to the Department of Fish and Wildlife Fisheries Restoration Grant Program on the coast to try to benefit anadromous fish. So in summary, private landowners, public agencies, nonprofit groups can access technical and financial assistance through CAL FIRE, NRCS, and other organizations. One of the things I heard this morning is that they're having trouble finding people, and CAL FIRE hire people to be the service foresters. So if you're looking for a job and you happen to be a forester, you should probably check into the CAL FIRE availability of positions now, because they've got money to do this and they need people to extend the money to the clients. So funding is for private landowners primarily available through CFIP and EQIP. And there's some new programs that have emerged. In the case of the GGRF, there's funding has not been allocated. That's a potential large source of assistance, but it hasn't been allocated for 2016. And one can ponder why.